in order then to show what is happening then, kind of at the same time while Europeans are doing stuff in other parts of the planet. Now, we briefly mentioned the 30 Years' War in the last chapter, but we will go into a bit more detail right now. And so just as a reminder, okay, remember when Christianity starts, it's all the Catholic Church, okay? For the first 1,000 years, Catholic equals Christian, Christian equals Catholic. I didn't write it up there. In 1059, the Catholic Church splits into the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And then I should have written the date, okay, 1519, you have what is called the Reformation, where, led by Martin Luther, because of various issues he has with the Catholic Church, we see then another division, and so we still have the Catholic Church, but then we end up with a group of churches known as a Protestant. We get that from the word to protest, okay? And so those that followed Martin Luther became known as Lutheran. One of the things that Martin Luther taught was that each person needed to interpret the scriptures and religion and Christianity according to themselves and how it best suited them. So hence the et ceteras. And we looked at Calvinism really quickly, a movement by John Calvin. But basically, this is where we begin to see the split into various Christian factions. Now, while not in your textbook, okay, I did include a brief little thing, and I'm just going to write, let me say screw Roman numerals for now. The Church of England, which also breaks off from the Catholic Church, precipitated by Henry VIII because he is looking to divorce his wife, and the Catholic Church doesn't permit divorce, and so basically Henry VIII removes the Pope and puts himself as the head of the Church of England. Okay, so I'll catch up from last chapter. All right, there we go. And just so you know, and this is one of the issues that many of the countries and why, basically Spain and Portugal kept their 100-year advantage. For about 100 years after Martin Luther's movement, so until about the 1620s, there was all kinds of religious conflict in Europe. Okay, they were fighting each other. Basically, my Jesus is better than your Jesus. Okay, which form of Christianity would be dominant, and so once that period ends is when we see England and France and all of them trying to catch up to Spain and Portugal. Now, we briefly mentioned the 30 Years' War, okay, in the last chapter, to give you a little bit more detail, because the 30 Years' War, and yeah, we can't think of better names, because guess how long it lasted? Yeah, 30 years. There was three things that happened, or like three objectives that were going on, okay? Number one, all right, because most of this happened in Germany, okay, or what today would be Germany, all right? Remember, though, that back then there was no Germany. There was just a lot of different German kingdoms. And so the kingdoms that wanted to follow the teachings of Martin Luther basically get into a war with the kingdoms that want to remain Catholic. All right, so it becomes a religious war. All right, now, the Catholic forces were led by the Holy Roman Empire. If you recall from the last exam, it was this confederation of German kingdoms. At the head of it was the Austrians, because it was always an Austrian, it was always a Habsburg that became Holy Roman Emperor. Okay? It was an elected position, just so you know. It wasn't like you were born into it. All right? Issue number two was control over various areas in Europe. Okay, you got to think back, all right? Remember when Spain is first formed, it's Ferdinand and Isabella, and they come together. They're both, king, queen of two different kingdoms, and it forms Spain, okay? And when it comes to royalty in Europe, basically one royal family would marry another royal family, and then they marry another royal family, and so eventually everybody's related, okay? Everybody is like basically cousins, okay? Now, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Ferdinand and Isabella began marrying into the Habsburg family, who were rulers over Austria, okay? Some of them were marrying into the Bourbon family, which were the rulers of France. I know I haven't mentioned them before, but trust me, it was the Bourbons, okay? Eventually, though, the direct line from Ferdinand and Isabella kind of faded away. There wasn't a firstborn son to carry on. And so the next, closest line was actually the Habsburg line, okay? Because, Spanish line, you get to the Austrian. Austrian line had been intermarrying, and now that there were no more Spanish, it was an Austrian prince that was entitled to the throne. But the French were like, no. We have just as much right because our family's married into the Spanish royal family as well, and Austria already controls the Holy Roman Empire. It's basically them. They're already like this with the Pope, all right? If we let them control Spain now, all right, no, that's not going to fly. We need to put like a French prince there, because the French have just as much claim because, like I said, they've married into the Spanish royal family as well. Okay, and then finally, during this time, Spain was actually in control of the Netherlands, and so the Dutch used this opportunity. Number one, the Dutch are Calvinist, okay, so they're Protestant, but they used this opportunity to win their independence from Spain, okay? So the 30 Years' War involved more than just religion, but religion was the main factor. Now, some of the things about the 30 Years' War, number one, this was the first war where civilians were attacked on purpose. Up until this time, most warfare, it was done on an open field, and it was just army versus army. Okay, many times civilians would show up just to watch the fighting and then go home after it was done. But typically, because the fighting was done, via knights, and they were the warrior class, and so, it was knight versus knight. They weren't going to attack an innocent civilian because that would not be honorable. But all of that changed when religion gets involved. Okay, they didn't care. They started attacking civilians because they figured, hey, we take them out, then the warrior class is going to, try to defend the civilians, and so we can start, wrecking, their base. We can, keep the people that feed them, from feeding them, and all of that stuff. And so by the end of the war, which is 30 years, over a third of the German population had been wiped out. All right. And it wasn't just warfare, but also, disease, famine, all the other things that come along. And I say it was just the Germans because for the most part, 90% of the fighting took place in what today would be modern day Germany. Okay. Now, once again, even though it involved, other countries, all of the fighting, or like I said, about 90% of the fighting happened inside this red line. Okay. And so you had basically, Catholic countries, Catholic countries, Protestant countries, and just anyone else that, kind of wanted to get involved. The Dutch were fighting for their independence, the Holy Roman Empire and the French were fighting over who gets to control Spain, all right? So it was just a big old mess when it came to this, okay? Now, the war ends in 1648, okay? The results, of this war, nobody really wins when it came to the religious part, It was a tie. Protestants and Catholics were even, all right? The only thing that actually resulted from this is that if you were a Protestant in a Catholic kingdom, you could move, you could leave and go to a Protestant kingdom. And if you were Catholic, in a Protestant kingdom, then you could go to a Catholic kingdom. All right, so you did not have to live in an area where other people didn't have your religious beliefs. Okay, so and that was the big thing. Okay, that you could actually move to a kingdom that either practiced Catholicism or practiced some form of Protestantism, depending on your own religion. Okay, that was the big thing. The Netherlands got their independence. Okay, so the Dutch were free of Spanish control. And of course, we've already seen, what the Dutch end up doing. They go to Asia, they go to India, they start growing sugar, they start killing locals and replacing them and buying, selling. Eventually, they're allowed to go into Japan because, they don't care about religion. They just, want money and all of that stuff. Okay? The Habsburgs, yay, the Austrians, they take control of Spain. Okay, so for the next, I want to say 200 years, 150, because it's somewhere in the 1700s, that they're known as the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. Eventually, the Spanish Habsburgs also die out, it's kind of what happens when you marry your cousins and, the line just doesn't continue. And so eventually the Bourbons do end up, entering the fray, but it happens like 150 years later. Okay, but yes, all right, because the Spanish family died out, now we have the Austrian family. And they do eventually learn Spanish, they become integrated into the society. And so, yes, they are known as the Spanish Habsburgs. But for the rest of Europe, specifically, okay, let me go back to the map, specifically everything inside the red line, all right, it takes over 100 years for that part to recover, which is why, you have French colonies, you have English colonies. Wow. You have Dutch colonies, but you don't have, German colonies in other parts of the world. You don't have stuff like that. Okay? So, now, what happens? What are some of the effects and what are some of the things that we see changing in Europe? Okay, before the 30 Years' War, okay, as I mentioned, the fighting that we associate with medieval times, where it was knights, armies, small armies of knights on horseback, okay, that's no longer the case. And, they'd attack the castles because that's where, the local king was, or the duke, or the count. That's where the armies would hide out, to protect themselves, okay? During the 30 Years' War, they stopped doing that, okay? What, you're going to lock yourself up in the castle? Fine, do that. We're just going to attack the villages. We're going to attack, where your blacksmith lives, where your farmers live, where, your animal trainers live. And if you don't have a blacksmith, you're not going to have weapons. We just killed all your farmers, you're not going to have food. So lock yourself up in the castle as long as you want. You'll eventually starve to death. Okay? And so we see this idea, this concept of total warfare. Okay? Attacking civilians and attacking, the infrastructure, as opposed to only attacking the castles, which is where the king and his army were. Okay? Now, because of this, okay, we begin to see then that the armies begin to open up, because once again, throughout the Middle Ages and up until this time, it was typically just the warrior class. It was just the knights that fought, okay? But if we're attacking the villages, okay, the people from the villages then are going to fight back, and once the whatever army has moved through, or maybe they've been beaten back, okay, our local baker says, they destroyed my bakery, I want to get revenge. And so Baker, leaves his, you're like, it's okay, Santos. Leaves his bakery behind. He gets a spear, a sword, bow and arrow, whatever, primitive armor, and joins the military and pledges his loyalty to the king. Okay. In addition, we begin to see, okay, number one, mercenaries. These are people that fight for money because and I promise I'll come back, because most of the war took place right here, okay? People from other areas, especially Italy, all right, and parts of France and Switzerland, even though they had no real interest, I guess if you're Italian, you know, you do want to fight for Catholicism, all right? But in this case, pay me enough and I'll fight for whatever cause you want. And it was the first time that we begin to see this, okay? In addition, because we need more people to fight, people that were sentenced to crimes were basically like, okay, you're sentenced to 5 years in the army because we need soldiers. So, you know, oh, you love killing so much? Go kill the enemy, all right, type of thing, all right? Before this time, okay, if you wanted to be an officer, okay, you either were appointed by the king. So obviously, you know, your family was close to the king's family. Usually the officers were also part of like the ruling class, the nobility, all right? And so they were appointed by the king, or you literally just bought your way into a position, okay? During the 30 Years' War, obviously, people realized, well, just because you have enough money to buy yourself, you know, into being, let's say, a captain, doesn't mean you actually know how to fight. It just means you had enough money to buy the title. And so after the 30 Years' War, leaders begin to realize, hey, maybe we should have some kind of qualification for being able to lead people, and not just the fact that you're related to like the local duke. Sorry, you're the local duke, and so we'll take the duke's cousin and make him an officer. Well, no, that means nothing other than you're related to someone important, okay? And finally, it is the 30 Years' War where the armies begin to abandon like lances and spears and swords and begin to use guns, you know. They had been around, all right, don't get me wrong, but in this war, we begin to see them used with much more frequency. Now, don't think of guns like today. It was literally a musket ball and, you know, stuffing it in and very primitive, but it is the first usage, okay, in major combat, okay? And so after the 30 Years' War, pretty much, you know, the countries that came out on top, and even some of the German countries that, you know, were destroyed, most European economies came out on top, all right? Especially the English and the Dutch, okay? The biggest exception, of course, was Spain, all right? Because they were so motivated to fight for Catholicism, okay? They spent most of their money, which was coming from the Americas, they spent most of their money in trying to, you know, push Catholicism, not just in Germany, but also in England, okay? Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about the Great Armada. The king at the time, Philip, tried to invade England, and he failed miserably, and in the process lost like 95% of the Spanish Navy and most of their soldiers. And so I don't make you memorize dates, but Santos knows this one. All right, after 1588, okay, Spanish power begins to descend. That's the date of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, all right, and English power begins to rise, okay? Now that the Dutch are independent, okay, remember, what is their only big concern when it comes to trade? Are they looking to spread Dutch religion, Dutch culture? What do they want? Whoever said money, yes. All they care about is money, all right, is making, that's why the Japanese would only trade with them. All right, because they didn't bring those, you know, stupid missionaries along. No, they just brought stuff to trade. They brought gold, they brought silver, they brought Dutch stuff, and they bought, they sold, and that was it. Okay, so some of the innovations, okay, in this case, because everything was being done via the ocean, all right, they do improve shipping. They do make advances in boat building and, you know, making them, I don't want to use the word automated, all right, because it really wouldn't apply to this. But basically, ships that were bigger, but they were able to make it so that they would operate with a smaller crew. Okay, so number one, I don't have to pay as many sailors. Okay, but number two, if the boats are bigger, what am I going to be able to put in there if not crew? Stuff, yes. So you're making more money, you're paying less, because instead of hiring all of you to run the ship, I'm only hiring these five, all right, because that's all we need. And so the rest of it, okay, now, thinking of today's like stock exchange and investment and speculative banking, most of that was invented by these early Dutch people. Okay, because they realize not everyone has, money up front. Not everybody has, all of their, financial stuff ready. So let's open up this whole thing with credit and loans and whatnot, so that we'll make the money back. Okay, we will. All right, but we just have to, invest that initial stuff up front. And finally, before this time, we literally had no concept of insurance, okay? What is insurance? D? Okay. Where do they get their money to pay you for if something happens?
Premiums.
Yes. Okay. The odds are, my sister used to work in insurance. The odds are that nothing will ever happen to you. So every month you're paying X amount. Okay. And what is that insurance company doing with it? They're holding it. Okay. They're investing it because now we have like a stock exchange and all that shit. Okay. And something does happen to Emily's boat, all right, then yes, we can cover her. We can pay her for the damages, for the lost merchandise, etc., etc. In the meantime, all of you are still paying premiums. And let's say, Angelina owns a boat for 50 years. She sails to Asia. She becomes rich. And yeah, she makes her premiums on time. She constantly pays. And finally, she decides to retire, never once having shipwrecked or lost a cargo or anything. Where has that money gone? Yeah. Before this time, people didn't grasp that concept. All right? And honestly, I'm not saying go without insurance, but odds are that you will probably never, ever need, because today, what's the most common thing we have insurance for? Cars. Oh, or house, okay. But cars. Okay, odds are, and some of you are like, Santos, I've already been in like 5 accidents. Okay, you're like a huge risk. Anissa's like, yeah, all right. I'm 51 years old. Yeah, if I could like go back and be like, well, fuck this shit. I'm not going to be paying monthly premiums for the next, like what? I've had my own shit since like 30 years? No, hell no. I'm not going to get that money back. Type of thing. So
if something does happen, though, the payout is actually pretty good.
Yes.
I had an accident a little over a year ago, almost killed me. I got $70,000 for it, changed my life. So
yeah.
You know what I mean?
So yes, if it does happen, it's there. But for most of us, and so before this time though, nobody had that concept. Nobody had that idea. All right, because remember, what do the Dutch care about? Yeah, and they knew. Yeah, it's not like every ship is going to sink and they're going to lose all their. I mean, when that happens, yes, insurance companies go under. When everyone files it. But if okay, Emily's ship sank, and then like 30 years later, all right, Liz's ship sank. Okay, well, we've gone 30 years without ever having to pay off anyone. Okay, so yeah, all right, it becomes this thing, and pretty soon it spreads. Okay, it spreads to other countries, and well, we know what it's like today. Okay, now, what are England and France doing? Because, yes, the Spanish and the Portuguese had that 100-something year head start. The Dutch are focused on money. All right. So England and France now are working hard to not only eliminate the Spanish and the Portuguese as competitors, but anyone else, but of course, eliminate each other as competitors as well. Okay. And so one thing that the English do in 1659, it's called the Navigation Act, where if you were an English colony or an English subject, you could only ship your goods on English ships, okay? Thereby establishing a monopoly. And if you think back to the lecture we had in the last chapter on mercantilism, money is power, power is money, okay? What is your purpose as a good Englishman, let's say? England needs, more money, more power. Okay, wealth is limited. We've got to give more of it to England. So if you're a good English subject, then yes, an English ship should carry English cargo. But what if the Dutch ship is cheaper? Yeah, okay. So it was difficult to enforce, but this was one way that England was trying to get a bigger slice of the pie. Okay, by keeping their subjects from using other countries. Okay, when it came to farming, all right, because remember, okay, not every place had gold and silver the way the Spanish found. Okay, you couldn't grow sugarcane everywhere. Most of the places that you could grow it in, the Spanish and the Portuguese already had. All right, so it's not like you're going to go to upstate New York and try to grow sugarcane. You can't. It's cold. It's not hot enough, not humid enough. And so we begin to see then, okay, improvements in farming. All right, just regular, normal farming stuff. Okay, and so we see then, number one, improvements in irrigation, okay, water drainage. Now, if you took History 101, you know that cultures like the Persians and the Egyptians and Mesopotamians had been doing this for thousands of years. Finally, the Europeans kind of discover it and begin to apply it to their stuff, okay? They actually begin to understand basic breeding. And so, in this case, like, hey, if we combine the good qualities of this animal, this sheep with this other, brand of sheep, if we mate them together, we could hopefully get the best of both sheep species or sheep types, and so we begin to see those types of things, very rudimentary, okay? Now, it's funny because I actually just did this lecture in my History 101 class this morning, okay? This was something that the Chinese came up with in like 1000 BCE, okay? Europeans begin to do it during the Middle Ages, but it doesn't actually have a more profound effect until Europeans begin to do it in the Americas, when they start, expanding. Four-field crop rotation, okay? What do I mean by this, okay? Or what is meant by this? The colonists and people in Europe would divide their farms into 4 fields. And one of them would always remain empty, okay? Now, just basics, I'm not a farmer, I'm not even a botanist or whatever, but all plants soak up the nutrients from the soil, okay? Some plants soak them up quicker than others, okay? And so by doing this, you would allow a field to regain, its fertility naturally. Because if you were just constantly planting on it year after year after year, eventually it would lose, all the nutrients in the soil, and then the land would become worthless. And so the next season, you would leave the other field empty so that it could do the same thing, okay? And then, of course, the year after that, all right, and the year after that, all right? Now, in addition, okay, the colonists and you know, the English, the French, the Spanish, they all realize that if they plant different crops in addition to just rotating the fields, okay, they could, you know, prolong the use of this land. And some things grew better in the summertime while other things grew better in the wintertime. And so now they're not only able to get year-round food, but also help their soil retain some of the nutrients. And we can't dismiss all of the things that the natives taught when Europeans first came over, that basically if you do take your scraps, if you do take like old fish and like animal remains and basically composting and mix it with the soil, okay, not just letting it sit, but then, you know, adding stuff to it, it would help the soil replenish itself as well, okay? And so remember, and this is one concept that I'm pushing in my 101, more food equals more people equals more food equals more people equals more food equals more people. Eventually you do hit a tipping point. But for now, okay, we are seeing this increase in the English colonies, the French colonies, etc. Okay? Now, what begins to happen, especially in Europe, in England and France, but it also starts to happen a little bit in the Americas, okay? People begin to acquire land, all right? And they begin to close it off, all right? Stay off my land, no trespassing. This is mine, okay? Now, of course, you do have the people that maybe can't afford to own their own piece of land, okay? And so, and obviously, you know, if I'm a landowner and I have a shit ton of land, maybe I can't get to it all in a season, all right? So we begin to see then the beginnings of, because remember, we no longer have peasants. It's no longer a feudal system where you grow your own thing and, you know, you work on my land for a little bit, okay? Can't do that anymore, but I can rent it to you, okay? So the idea of renting land, all right, so that you grow your own food, okay, and you make your own living, and as the landowner, you pay me for the privilege of working that land, whether it's part of what you grow, or usually what begins to happen is that you sell that food, all right, or whatever product, and then give me a certain part of the money, whatever we agreed on when we settled up our rental agreement. And so, because, you know, before this time, we're working on a feudal system where, you know, I control your lives, you do everything I say, and you work on my land for a little bit, and, you know, the purpose of farming, one thing you have to remember is that for most of human history, humans grew food and all of that stuff so that they wouldn't die. I mean, it wasn't because I love to farm, it's because that's the place where the food comes from. But now we begin to see the beginnings of commercial farming, okay? We don't get to it until like the 1800s, but the fact that you are not only growing food to feed yourself and your family, but why else are you growing food? Yes, you need the money to do what? Pay the landlord. Okay, so yes, now, you know, Anissa's farming apples, not because she loves apples, I mean, she does, that's why she's farming apples, all right, but, you know, she gets all the extra apples, she sells them at a market, and then, here, Mr. Santos, here's my rent for the month, thank you for letting me farm on this land that feels like mine, but is really yours, you know, type of thing. All right, and I'm sure those of us that live in an apartment and whatnot can understand the feeling. All right, but yeah, this is the beginning of that, okay, type of thing. All right, now, what time is it? Oh, okay. We're going to move exclusively to Europe, all right, because we begin to see the beginnings of a concept known as absolutism. All right, now, up until this time, okay, how do you get to be king? We've talked about this before. Yes, you're the son of the king. Which son? And he's oh my gosh, you knew where I was going. The firstborn son. Okay? Now, the concept is called divine right, where who chose or who put things into motion so that the firstborn son of whomever is the king? God. All right? Now, in France, we get Louis the 13th, okay, whose father dies when he's 9. All right? Now, Louis, despite being the firstborn, all right, very sickly, very like, bad health problems, asthma, and, he's small for his size, and, all this other stuff. Okay? Now, because he's 9, all right, he's not exactly going to be given the kingship yet. For a time, we have, numerous ministers appointed, and one of those ministers is a man named Cardinal Richelieu. Okay? That's his title. He was actually a Catholic cardinal, but he was French, all right? And he was one of the advisors of the previous king, okay? Now, people were looking at Louis and going, seriously? God chose this asthmatic, sickly, catches every disease known child as our king? This is the prime specimen that God wants to rule over us? The math ain't mathin', okay? Because God would have chosen like someone ripped and buff and, all this other stuff, okay? Because that's what a king should be, all right? And so, Richelieu, he hears the grumbles, he hears the complaints, and he wants to make sure that the monarchy stays in place and that someone doesn't see, a king that is physically weak and, who knows, maybe mentally also, all right, without disrupting the given order, okay? So what he does is he develops basically what becomes to known as an absolute monarchy, all right? All power rests with the king. You cannot question anything, all right? And it doesn't matter if the king is like the sickliest, the weakest, the dumbest, the most idiotic person on the planet. This is who God wants to be the king. Just remember, he's a religious guy, okay? And you can't go against God. Obviously, God chose this person for a reason, okay? And so, the cardinal sets things up so that even the worst king, pardon my French, literally will not fuck things up. All right? You'll still have the same family. Okay? Now, typically, all right, it's not the common people that rise up in rebellion and want to overthrow the king. Good job, common people. All right? It's usually the nobles. Okay? Remember, you guys get to be the nobles today. The nobility are the family of the king, but not in the direct line. Okay? So we have the king's aunt, all right? We have the king's brother. We have the king's cousin. We have his brother, okay? The second brother, okay? And all of that stuff, all right? The cardinal says, since they're the ones that are most likely to overthrow the king, and we can appoint the king's brother, okay? Who is like bigger and not sick and smarter and better at everything. Okay, or his cousin, who he's already proven himself in the war against England, so we know he's pretty powerful. We know he's smart. He came up with the Angelina strategy. That's a military maneuver. All of that stuff. Okay, so what does the cardinal do? He gets rid of the nobles. He takes away their privilege. He takes away all of their things, but we can't do it completely, okay? He gives them bullshit jobs, okay? Patrick, I know you are the king's cousin, and that up until now, you have been in charge of the finance ministry. You are now the official king's jacket chooser. It is your responsibility to make sure that the king has the nicest jacket today. Okay? Angelina, I know you were in charge of the military and you led that wonderful campaign against the English. You are now the royal shoe purveyor. You got to make sure that the king has very comfortable shoes because he's got a lot of stuff to do during the day. All right? Anissa, I know you're the king's aunt, and you know you have always had a lot of influence here, but you know what we need you to do? Is we need you to be on the council that chooses his wife's dresses. Because we can't have look at your fashion style, it's amazing. And we cannot have the queen go out looking like whatever. Thank you for the hand motion, because the nobility ate it up. They're like, yes, I will choose the best jacket for the king. Yes, the king will wear the most comfortable shoes he has ever worn, because that's my job, all right? And if it wasn't for me, you know, the queen would look like garbage, all right? So I'm gonna do all of this stuff. Okay? But wait a minute, who's gonna be the finance guy now? Who's gonna be the war minister? Who's gonna be in charge of all, like, the castle stuff? They went to the common people, all right? Hey, I know you do like this little accounting thing. How would you like to be the finance minister for all of France? It's like, oh, it pays a shit ton and you get to live in the palace. And you'll be like right there next to the king. Okay? I know you were just like a normal foot soldier, just like, you know, you took orders, you were a private. How would you like to be in charge of the military? Okay? Oh, and you also get to live in the castle and you get to like hang out with royalty. I know you're just like a simple dressmaker, you know, you take sacks and you make it look pretty. How would you like to make, you know, how would you like to be in charge of all of the things that happen in the castle? You tell the servants what to do, you fix the schedule, you hire the cooks, boom. Okay? These are just common people. They've just been elevated to those important roles in France. Are they going to be loyal to the king? Because remember, I brought you up. I can just discard you just as easily. Because behind you, there's like 10 other accountants that would kill for, you know, being in charge of France's money. All right? Don't worry, Patrick. You're choosing my coat. All right? That's just as important. I know you used to be the finance minister. All right? And so, yeah. All right? The French eat this up, and this becomes the basis, okay, for an absolute monarch. Okay? I will finish talking about this, all right, because there's more, because France does it, and the other countries are like, wait a minute, we want to be just as powerful as the French king. He literally has no opposition, all right? We'll talk about